Good to have your company. Good to be back here on World Have Your Say. Well, in a moment, I'll introduce you to some Ukrainians and Russians who are going to speak to us about the crisis in Ukraine. But first of all, let's cross straight over and speak to a Russian MP who joins us now. I'm pleased to say that Vyacheslav Nikonov joins us live from Moscow. Welcome to World Have Your Say, sir. First of all, I want to get your reaction to these latest lines coming from NATO. They're saying this has been a blatant violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. How do you respond to that very strong wording from NATO?
Well, Russia has been accused about aggression in Ukraine in the previous months. Round number one, round number two of sanctions were introduced because of these aggressions. And I think it's just the same. It's a fake. All these accusations of Russian aggression is just a fake, which is needed to explain why the Ukrainian army is suffering defeats, why the Ukrainian economy is in shambles, why the Ukrainian currency lost half of its weight, why Ukraine is ungoverned. And there should be some big explanation to that. And this big explanation is, of course, Russia. So I think NATO can use whatever harsh words. I think it would be more useful for NATO in terms of providing some arguments to Russia, to provide some evidence. And that is not happening.
You talk about that evidence, sir. NATO would say it has provided that evidence. It says it has satellite images of Russian artillery over the border in Ukraine, and it also says it has evidence that around 1,000 Russian troops are operating inside Ukraine.
Well, I think they should provide this evidence, because by far what they showed were some pictures which were not identified in time and place, and some of these pictures were taken from computer games.
You genuinely believe that? You don't believe these are satellite images? You think they're made up from computer games?
No, I think there may be some satellite images, but the satellite images were taken, at least in the past, different time, different place. So by far, I haven't seen any evidence provided by NATO except the words and some fakes taken from the internet.
So do you deny there are any Russian troops at all in Ukraine operating and fighting against Ukrainian soldiers?
Absolutely not. I think it's really very hard to confess for the Ukrainian army and for their patrons in Washington that the Ukrainian army is now suffering defeats to the coal miners, taxi drivers, and few retired military. But that's exactly what's happening.
But these claims that Russian soldiers are operating inside Ukraine are not just coming from the outside and coming from the West. Russians themselves are saying that Russian troops are operating there. We know that relatives are gathering outside a base north of Moscow saying that they believe their soldiers are fighting in Ukraine. They want to know where they are. There have been confirmed sightings of funerals in Russia of servicemen that Russian people say have died fighting in Ukraine. And the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers have said they've seen a list of 400 Russian soldiers who are either dead or wounded, their men fighting in Ukraine. So are Russians lying as well?
Well, especially concerning this information, I can tell there are quite a few Russian NGOs funded from the United States, from European sources, which are now providing this sort of information. Exactly the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers you mentioned is definitely foreign-funded NGO. So they're not very trustworthy. Actually, I didn't have any hard evidence inside Russia. And most of this information is also looked to me like a complete fake. Of course, there are Russians there, Russian citizens, but there is no Russian army. There are many Russian volunteers, for sure, maybe hundreds of them. But there are volunteers on all the sides. There are not only Russian volunteers on the side of the rebels, but also French volunteers, Serbish, Polish, whatever. And there are many volunteers on the side of the Ukrainian army from the United States, from many European countries. This is a civil war which is going on there. Russia is not side of the conflict. There is also much of a wishful thinking that Russia should come and fight a big war in Ukraine. That will not happen.
Well, Mr. Nikonov, lots of our viewers have got in touch with us over the last few hours once they've known that you're coming on the programme, and I want to put those questions to you. But first of all, can you just tell me, NATO has said it will accept Ukraine's application for membership. If Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, what will Russia's reaction be?
I think that will not happen in any foreseeable future, because I don't think NATO is in a suicidal mood. Ukraine in NATO means just one thing, that today there is Ukraine were in NATO today. That means Article 5, with the implication of war with Russia, NATO war with Russia, on faked evidence of Russian aggression. And that is that could probably be the last war of the humankind. So I don't think it's a realistic proposal. I think it's just a rhetoric, and I don't think that is just going to happen.
But if it did happen, are you saying if Ukraine joined NATO, there would be war between NATO and Russia?
Well, that is going to be quite automatic, because the Washington Treaty is about collective security. Collective security includes Article 5 guarantees. That means that if one member of NATO is attacked, then all NATO is attacked and it has to go into war. So now, if Ukraine were in NATO, that would mean that, and there is what you call an evidence that Russia is acting against Ukraine, that means automatically, according to the Washington Treaty, that NATO should start the war against Russia.
Well, Mr. Nikonov, let me put a couple of questions to you which have come in from our viewers around the world. Umba in Nigeria on Facebook says, Mr. Nikonov, it's obvious that Russia wants to see a divided Ukraine. Please pardon my curiosity. What does Russia have to gain with a divided Ukraine? Who will it benefit?
Well, Russia is not part of this conflict, first place. The question is based on the assumption that Russia is really fighting there. Russia is not. It is the Ukrainian government which was brought to power after an unconstitutional coup, which was not recognized by many regions of Ukraine. And instead of talking to these regions or providing some benefits to this region, talking about federalization of Ukraine, they just sent armed forces which were shelling cities, towns, killing old people, children, women in thousands. And this, of course, caused counter-reaction by the local people. 95% of the army of Donetsk and Lugansk, or they call them now themselves the army of Novorossiya, these are local people just protecting their homes, their families from the Ukrainian army, which is destroying their land.
Let me put one more question to you, Mr. Nikonov, before we let you go. Philip on Facebook says, why is Russia waging war on a country that Russia couldn't possibly see as an enemy? The culture and personal ties are so intertwined.
Russia is not fighting the war in Ukraine, first place. If Russian troops were there, you know, the situation would have been completely different, because I don't think there is any military objective in Ukraine that Russian forces cannot achieve in a matter of days. Russian forces are not there, and Russia will not join this war. Of course, maybe some people in Washington, some people in Kiev would like to present it as a war between Russia and Ukraine, but Russia is not going to come to that war.
Mr. Nikonov, thank you so much for joining us here on World Have Your Say. So many more questions coming in, unfortunately.